So there was a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences titled Brighter Nights and Darker Days Predict Higher Mortality Risk, a prospective analysis of personal light exposure in over 88,000 individuals. Now, the title really gives away the conclusion of this study already, and that is that in order to increase longevity and decrease our risk for a multitude of medical conditions, we should sleep with as little light as possible at night and try to get as much natural sunlight as possible without, of course, sustaining skin damage during the day. Now, the key takeaway points here were that those with the highest daylight exposure had a 17 to 34% reduced mortality versus those with the lowest daylight exposure. Now, the researchers looked at data from the UK Biobank participants and evaluated over 13 million hours of light exposure data that were recorded by wrist sensors. So these participants, they were wearing these wrist sensors, right? And they had a total of 89,000 participants over a course of 1 week where they recorded this. And then they looked at follow-up data over a period of 8 years, in which almost 800 of the original 89,000 participants had experienced cardiometabolic death. In other words, died of a condition like a heart attack. The authors noted that those participants in the 70th to 100th percentile of night light exposure, so in other words, those with the highest night light exposure, had a 13 to 34% increased risk of all-cause mortality versus those participants that had very little night light exposure, so that slept mostly in complete darkness. And again, we're only talking about actual light exposure during nighttime here, nothing else. Now, a possible mechanism here is the disruption of the circadian rhythm, so the quality of sleep at night, resulting in daytime exhaustion and tiredness, with fluctuations in blood pressure, insulin, hormone production, cortisol secretion, and other negative health parameters. These differences could lead to an increased risk for heart attacks, stroke, diabetes, obesity, and ultimately death. Now, when it comes to daylight exposure, those with the highest percentile, so those with the most daylight exposure, had a 17 to 34% reduced risk for all-cause mortality compared to those with low daylight exposure. Again, this seems to be due to the effect of light, in this case daylight, on circadian rhythm, where increased daylight has a positive impact on our sleep-wake cycle, which therefore decreases risk factors for all-cause mortality. Now, the authors they further explain that together with the observed relationships of brighter nights and darker days with mortality risk, these findings support the notion that circadian disruption is a potential mechanism linking light exposure with mortality risk. Now, I referred in another video already to the work of Dr. Roger Schultz, whose documentary Light as Medicine really looked at cutting-edge scientific data on the importance of melatonin production in our mitochondria related to near-infrared radiation. Now, at night, we need a very dark environment for the appropriate release of melatonin from the pineal gland in our brain. And this is to help us to get good quality sleep and help us fall asleep and stay asleep, right? During the daytime, exposure to near-infrared radiation from sunlight, and we can even get this from indirect sun exposure and even in the winter months in the northern hemispheres. So this is not like UV exposure, where in the winter months, we don't really make enough vitamin D3 because UV exposure is greatly reduced. But near-infrared exposure is fairly constant throughout the year, a little bit higher in the summer, of course, but there's sufficient amounts even winter months. Now, this near-infrared then causes the production of melatonin in the mitochondria of our cells. And this is sort of new research. We didn't really understand this until fairly recently, right? Now, as the infrared light penetrates fairly deeply into our bodies, and it even goes through bone, right? And our mitochondria contain more than 90% of the total melatonin in our bodies. So the pineal gland holds 5% of our melatonin in our bodies, and that gets released at night or in the evening in order to help us sleep. But 90 to 95% of our melatonin really is in the mitochondria of our cells. And again, this is fairly new findings that Dr. Schultz outlined, I think, very brilliantly in his documentary, right? So this daily sunlight exposure is extremely important for us. Compared to, I would say, about 100 years ago, our daily exposure to near-infrared light has significantly declined by roughly 90%. And that is not only due to us not spending as much time outdoors, but it's also due to factors like using LED light bulbs. And these LED light bulbs do not emit near-infrared light. Now, when we use the regular incandescent light bulbs that would use more energy and that would get hot, that would heat up, right? They would actually emit near-infrared light. And there was a significant amount that we would get just by sitting in our rooms, having the ceiling light or some light source in our room on. So the LEDs do not have near-infrared light. And so we're already missing out there. And then also, we're using low energy glass in our windows, and that filters out near infrared light from the outside. So not much gets into our houses anymore. So there's a decrease there as well, right? So we're spending less time outside, and we're blocking ourselves from receiving near infrared light. So it seems that our scientific advances that help us save energy also make us less healthy. Now, given this information, all we have to do to improve our cardiometabolic health and allow for restful sleep with proper hormone production and muscle recovery is to make sure that we sleep in a very dark environment without any computers or cell phones in our room, ideally, and make an effort to spend more time outdoors during the daytime. And this could be as simple as taking our lunch outdoors or increasing our time taking walks and hiking outside. And if your goal is to increase muscle mass, which for most of us it really should be, especially if you're over the age of 40, then this is also a very helpful strategy. Because as I mentioned before, good quality sleep is crucial for hormone production, especially testosterone. So improving our circadian rhythm with these simple changes will decrease our risk of heart attacks, strokes, diabetes, and obesity, and improve lean muscle mass and fat burning. And if you ask any professional athlete, they will tell you how important sleep is to reaching their physical peak form.